Thank you, Daphne. Thank you, Javi, for your comments and introduction. And a special thanks to all of you who are tuning in from the country where you live or are presently residing. And I just want to say I appreciate your time very much. Thank you for watching this lecture today on the history of money. I want to begin by pointing out that economists usually speak in terms of two kinds of goods. One kind of good is a free good, and a free good is one that does not command a price in the marketplace because, at least relative to our wants, it's in such superabundance that you can consume as much of it at no cost without worrying that there wouldn't be enough for somebody else. Typically, air is a free good. And the only time when you might purchase air is if you want it in a certain form, in a certain container, such as, let's say, for a scuba diver. That person will pay money for a tank full of what is otherwise typically free, but has to be placed in a certain state so that he can use it underwater. Those kinds of goods, free goods, are not typically of much concern to economists, but we simply note that they exist. What we're concerned about are economic goods, and economic goods are characterized by the fact that they do command a price in the marketplace. You can readily observe people buying and selling them. People exchange their possessions, their money, or other goods to acquire an economic good. Relative to our demands, they are scarce, unlike free goods. There's just not enough of them for everybody to have the quantity they want without any cost. So that's what concerns economists, economic goods in the marketplace. And then under economic goods, I can say there are three kinds of economic goods. One is a consumer good, and as you might imagine, because this is a common term that people use all the time, even non-economists, a consumer good is one destined for consumption. We acquire it as consumers because we intend to use it, to consume it. Something like, say, an ice cream cone, we have every intention of consuming it rather readily, and then it's gone. Consumer goods are ultimately what we're after as human beings. But to get there, we often need another kind of goods, a kind that is required to help us produce consumer goods. And the name for the second kind of economic good is a capital good. A capital good is, say, a tool or a piece of equipment or a coal mine, the kinds of things that you and I, as ordinary everyday consumers, wouldn't necessarily be interested in, but we do know that without those things in the hands of producers, we wouldn't get the consumer goods that we're after. Sometimes capital goods are referred to as goods of higher order. We use them and they have value because they are necessary for the production of what we are ultimately after, which is consumer goods. The third kind of economic good is the topic of my lecture today, money. And I think it's important, that's why I spent a few moments talking about those other economic goods, to recognize that money is in a category all of its own. It's different from other economic goods, at least for a couple reasons. In fact, let me give you two reasons why money is in a category of its own within the broader framework of economic goods. The first reason it's unique or different is that it is only useful for what it gets you in exchange. It's only useful for what it gets you in exchange. In other words, if you think of whatever you use as money today, your national currency or what other people at other times have used, such as gold and silver coins, even a good money, this is just as true for. And that is that it's only useful for what it gets you in exchange. If you couldn't get goods and services with whatever form of money you may be using, if you couldn't get goods and services with it, then the money wouldn't have any value. Its whole purpose is to give you the opportunity, or the means, I should say, to acquire what you're really after, whether it be a consumer good or perhaps a capital good or producer good. So it's only useful for what it gets you in exchange. All the money in the world will leave you starving if you can't get food with it. All the money in the world will leave you cold if you haven't the ability with it to purchase shelter. So think of it as a means to what you're really after, and therefore it's so important that there's something there that you can get with it. And a second reason money is in a category of its own is that unlike capital goods and consumer goods, the supply of money must remain scarce in order to perform its function. Its supply must remain scarce to perform its function. Now, this is tough for a lot of people to grasp, especially politicians who think that, hey, if I'm in charge of the money supply, wouldn't it be great for everybody if I could just create more of it? But money is not like capital or consumer goods. If you could double the quantity of consumer goods tonight, or capital goods, of course we'd have problems of, where we're going to put it all, but those would be a lot better problems to have than the problems of how do you bring them into being in the first place. You can double the quantity of consumer goods tonight, if you could, I should say. We would be roughly doubly rich tomorrow. That's very roughly interpreted because a lot of it we just couldn't use. We may have enough of certain consumer goods right now, but nonetheless, our standard of living would be higher by roughly the amount by which we've doubled the quantity of consumer goods. If you double the supply of money, you really haven't doubled what we're really after in marketplaces. You're not increasing the supply of goods and services, you're just increasing the claims to goods and services that may exist. Well, with that as backdrop, I want to quickly move to a definition of money. I've implied it already, but let's give it a firm definition right now. Money is the medium of exchange. And this is, again, a big reason why it's different from capital goods and consumer goods. It's the medium of exchange, or another way to think of it is it's a middleman. You trade for it not because you intend to consume it, as you would, say, an ice cream cone or even a gold mine. You trade for it because you intend to, sometimes very quickly, or at least ultimately, get rid of it. You intend to pass it on. You intend to use it as a means to acquire what you're really hoping to get. Okay, that makes it rather unique. It is a middleman in exchange. If you couldn't get anything with it, as I mentioned before, well, then the money itself would cease to have value because it's typically in a form that you can't eat or you can't wear, except maybe as jewelry. But beyond those limited uses, money is principally a medium of exchange. Now, some people, in fact, some dictionaries will add additional definitions. Most dictionaries will say, yes, it's a medium of exchange. That's typically the first definition provided. But then some will go on to say it's also a storehouse of value, a storehouse of value. In my belief, that's not really an additional definition. It sort of comes under the banner of medium of exchange. If you've got something that is good and reliable and widely recognized as a medium of exchange, you know you can trade it for what you're ultimately after, well then it will become a storehouse of value. If it's relatively stable in value and you've got this substance that can get you what you're really after, sometimes you don't want to spend it immediately, you put it aside. You may invest it, earn a return off of it. And so it's storing some value over time until you use it ultimately in exchange for a good or service. So a storehouse of value may be an additional description, but it's not a new definition of money. You get that value when you've got the first, when the substance has met the first definition, which is a medium of exchange, a middleman. Some will say also that it's a measure of value. And this I would caution against. I don't regard money as a measure of value, simply because just think of all the times you've traded money to acquire a good and thought that you got a fantastic bargain. How many times have you done that and said maybe moments later, wow, I would have paid double for that. I got a good deal. Well, that suggests that the value to you was more than perhaps the monetary price suggested. So remember that value is very personal and very subjective. The price of something is not a measure of its value. It is the exchange ratio at which money changes hands with a good or a service, but it's not a measure of value. You may have many occasions when in fact you buy something and later you think, oh my gosh, I didn't need that, or it didn't do what I thought it would do. I wouldn't have paid half that if I had known some of these other factors later on. So it's not a measure of value, but it is the price of something expressed as money is an exchange ratio at which a trade takes place. Now, there is a sense in which we can say that money is the most important commodity in a market society. Now, you may be shaking your head saying, what? I thought Mr. Reed was an Austrian economist, or at least a believer in things that Adam Smith had to say well before the Austrians. Adam Smith pointed out that it's goods and services, not money, that determine the wealth of a nation. And I'm not conflicting with that at all. I'm just saying that there is a sense in which you can regard money as the most important commodity in a market society. What is that sense? What do I mean by that? What I'm saying is that money, because it is the medium of exchange, is the most important commodity in a market society in the sense that it's at least one part of every non-barter transaction. Now think of that. In a market society such as we all have today, or largely market societies, money and the prices it gives rise to is at least one part of every transaction that isn't a simple barter, good for a good exchange. And sometimes money is both sides of a transaction. If you buy euros with American dollars, there you've got money on both sides of the transaction. Most of the time, it's one of those two sides. And therefore, whatever affects money, because it's one side at least of every non-barter transaction, whatever affects money will affect almost everything else. You can, in fact, and I'll give you examples later in this talk, you can ruin an entire economy by mismanagement of money and its tandem mechanism we know as credit. More on that in a little later, but only in that sense can you say money is the most important commodity in a market society. But I will say that it is so important that if a society doesn't get it right, it will give rise to a great deal of mischief, erosion of savings, discouragement of savings and investment. Mismanaging money can produce booms and busts and all the attendant evils that come along with that phenomenon. So getting it right is important, and I think the first element of getting money right is recognizing what it is, what its purpose is, and where it originated. And that's what I'd like to get into now, that last point of where money came from. If you were to walk down most main streets in America and maybe even Latin America as well today and ask people randomly, where do you think money came from? I would guess that a lot of people would say, oh, well, that's government does that. That's a government function. Government produces money, whether it's for good or ill, at least it comes from government, must be an invention of government. And if you get nothing else from this talk, I hope you will understand and take away the notion that money is not an invention of government. It is an invention of the marketplace. In time, because whoever is in charge of it can find such command a very lucrative thing, governments take over money quite often. But they didn't originate it. It wasn't some king that said, oh, the peasants need money. Nobody's ever thought of it before until me. It arose naturally in the marketplace. And let me suggest how that likely happened. I think if you go back far enough in human history, you'll probably find a time when money hadn't yet been invented, when what primitive exchanges did occur were all in the form of barter, an exchange of a good for a good or a good for a service, and not involving any kind of intermediary, such as a money. And you know, as an economist, I would never say barter is a bad thing. Of course, if two traders come together and say, hey, I like your pen and I've got a pencil that you like, let's make a trade, hey, that's great. A pen for a pencil is an example of barter. There's no intermediary, no middleman, no money involved at all. But barter lends itself only to a fairly primitive economy. You could not have a modern, industrialized, globalized economy of international exchange like we do today if every trade had to be in the form of barter. It has serious limitations. I mean, for barter to happen, you have to have what the other person wants, and the other person has to want what you have. And that coincidence of wants is not always present. Most of the time it isn't, in fact. If you're a chicken farmer and you need gasoline, you are not going to get very far if you pull up to the gas station and say, here's some chickens, fill the tank. Somebody's going to say, I know what chickens are, I'm familiar with them, but I don't need any. And so you're not going to get very far. So the first time that a middleman entered the picture, I don't mean a person, I mean a substance in exchange, then money was born. And let me give you an example that I think is not very far-fetched. I could see this easily developing. Probably were times when societies were largely agricultural when precisely this thing happened. Let's imagine a farmer who grows wheat. And he's got a little bit more than he figures he can personally consume. And so he thinks, well, I can trade some of my surplus wheat for something else. I'd like some corn. So he goes down the road to the corn farmer and he says, hey, I've got a bushel of wheat here. Would you like to trade for a bushel of your corn? And let's say the corn farmer if the corn farmer says, yes, let's do it, well, then you've got barter, wheat for corn, end of story. But let's suppose the corn farmer says, I know you raise good wheat and I've got good corn, but I don't need any wheat. I'd rather have oats. If you bring me some oats, we can make a trade. So you, the wheat farmer, say, well, wait a minute, I'll be right back. I know an oat farmer down the road. So you go down the road to the oat farmer and you luck out. The oat farmer says, yeah, I'll trade for some of your wheat. So you give him your wheat and he gives you a bushel of oats. You take the oats back to the corn farmer and say, okay, I've got the oats that you want. How about a bushel of oats for a bushel of your corn? And he says yes. Now that sounds roundabout, right? Sounds a little bit complicated, certainly more so than barter would have been. But just think what happened. Everybody's a winner. You've got three parties to these various transactions here, and the end result is that through a medium of exchange, which in that example would be the oats, everybody ends up a winner. That's because of trades that couldn't have happened if you had to do it all on a barter basis. So even though it may seem at first to make things a little more complicated, the introduction of a middleman in exchange, actually facilitates trade that would otherwise not have happened at all. It makes possible a degree of commerce and prosperity that would never develop under a purely barter system. There are a lot of examples of money in history, substances that people have used as media of exchange. In every case, there are a couple features that explain why that substance arose as money in the first place. And certainly the key characteristic is familiarity. People have to say, oh, I know what that is. Yeah, I'll take that, even if I can't use it myself, even if I'm not able to or don't desire to consume it myself. I know other people who will, and so yeah, I'll trade for that with you. and then I'll take that substance to the guy I know who will want it. If you introduced a money that no one was familiar with, that everybody thought, what? Why would I trade for that? I can't use it for anything, and I don't know anybody who would use it for anything, you would reject it, and that substance would never arise freely in the marketplace as a money. But if it's something that people say, yeah, I know what that is, I can use it myself, or I can at least get something else with it from another person, then that substance has a chance to become a money. What we're saying here is that money is a marketable commodity. In fact, it is by definition the most marketable commodity in a society. Think of it. Money is the one thing that everybody will take from you, as long as it is still of value and they know they can get something else with it. So it's a highly liquid, highly marketable commodity. In Homer's time, Homer, of course, wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey. He talks about cattle being used as money, heads of cattle. It sounds awfully awkward today, doesn't it? That would mean that even prices would be reckoned in terms of a certain quantity of cattle. Now, from our standpoint, that would be a huge step backward, right? It would be extremely cumbersome and awkward. How would you make change, for instance, if your money is in the form of cattle? But we have to look at these primitive substances as nonetheless improvements over what came before. Otherwise, they would never have arose as money in a marketplace of free exchange. It's not hard to imagine in a primitive society, hundreds and hundreds of years BC, largely agricultural in nature, that people would say, oh yeah, I know what that is, that's a cow. And I know I can either eat it or milk it, or I can trade it for something else. So sure, I'll make a deal with you. So it's not hard to imagine in Homer's time that cattle might emerge, as it did, as money. He also talked about iron cauldrons, big iron pots that people would cook things in, were used as money. That means that prices were reckoned in terms of quantity of iron cauldrons and or their size. Primitive by our standards, but an improvement over whatever they used before, or they wouldn't have changed. Also in the history of money, you'll find seashells used widely in various parts of the world. In the colony of Virginia in America in its early days, tobacco was used as money. And that's not hard to imagine. Tobacco was widely grown in Virginia in the 1600s. And for a time, because everybody knew what it was, knew that it had value, that they could smoke it themselves or trade it with someone else, they began even to reckon prices or express prices as quantities of tobacco. Interestingly, there was in fact a tobacco hyperinflation in Virginia, which was the main reason why people eventually rejected it. They found that they could, through better yields, fertilizers and what have you, they could greatly manufacture more quantities of tobacco, which meant that the value of any one leaf was drastically falling. So that doesn't make for a good money when the substance is losing value rapidly because of its overproduction. So people discover things that work better than what came before as money. But historically, they then may discover that something else works even better. For a time, in parts of the Middle East, hundreds of years ago, women were used as money. I know it's hard to imagine. It leaves maybe much to the imagination, but that wouldn't work very well today. I'll just leave it at that. If you're interested in more about the history of substances that served as money, there's a great book called The Evolution of Money by Rupert Ederer, spelled E-D-E-R-E-R, Rupert Ederer, The Evolution of Money. In that book, I once took notes on it because I thought the examples he provided were so odd. He said that rats were used as money on Easter Island for a time. It's just hard to imagine somebody taking a few rats into an ice cream parlor and saying, how about a chocolate ice cream cone for a couple of rats? I doubt that they had ice cream, but in any event, you get the point, that rats were used, as tough as that might be to imagine. In the islands of Fiji, whale's teeth were used as money. Mahogany logs were used in what is now Belize, formerly British Honduras. Lots of odd things. And people would use them for a time and then discover their shortcomings and discover something that worked better. And so they moved on. But all over the world, the demand for a reliable media of exchange over time, centuries ago, came to be centered upon the precious metals. This is an important development in monetary history. From all those primitive monies, eventually people discovered something that would work much better, gold and silver. And on every continent but Antarctica, where nobody lives, precious metals came to be used as money, not because some king demanded it or ordered it or invented it as money, but because people, through the process of trade, one evolutionary trade at a time, discovered that precious metals work pretty well, and for good reason. Their value tends to be relatively stable over time. You cannot so dramatically manufacture more of them that you could have a gold or silver hyperinflation, as you did with tobacco in Virginia. So they kept their value. That meant that people were more likely to want to trade for them because they knew if they didn't spend it right away, they could hold on to it and that'd be all right. They're also divisible. Gold and silver are easily divisible, meaning you can cut them up. You can shape them the way you want. You can reduce or increase their quantity by simply melting and determining the quantity, the weight of the metal that you want. You can make change rather easily, in other words. And money in the form of gold and silver also is very durable. Durability is not a feature that you have with your money if it's in the form of rats or women or seashells or tobacco. But gold and silver, you can find a treasure trove of gold and silver coins in a sunken Spanish galleon that's laid at the bottom of the ocean for 500 years, and just clean it up and it's as good as new. So that's a great advantage to the precious metals and helps explain why they emerged as a money. At first, historically, gold and silver as money tended to be found together and were minted, or at least used in lumps, as they were found naturally in a mix of gold and silver. Economists call that electrum, a mixture of gold and silver as they are sometimes found naturally. That was used as money, just lumps of gold and silver for a time. But you can see that even there's room for improvement. If your money is, even if it's as good as gold and silver, but if they're mixed and in these different sized lumps, that means that every time you make a trade, you have to weigh the stuff, you have to shave off a little bit if you've got more than you need, or you have to find some more shavings and add to the quantity in order to meet the price. That's a little bit cumbersome and awkward. And that gave rise to, in fact, a remarkable invention. Near as we can tell, it happened around 650 BC. And the invention I'm referring to is that of coinage. Coinage. Coinage is simply the standardization of gold and silver. And sometimes mixed together, but rather early they were separated. And so you had gold coins and silver coins separate from each other. But think of the advantage of that invention over just lumps of precious metal. All you had to do was look at the coin and you knew, because it said right on the coin, how heavy it was, what the weight of the metal was. You didn't have to have scales to weigh it out. You just looked at it and you knew what it was, how much it weighed, what it was worth. That swept the ancient world as a remarkable monetary invention, and within 100 years, that is about 550 BC, precious metal coins were widely used all throughout the Mediterranean world and would ultimately spread worldwide. Gold and silver coinage, in many respects, formed the foundation of the prosperity of ancient Greece. It's hard to imagine that prosperity could have arisen to the extent that it did if under any of the primitive forms of money that we've talked about already. Okay, so precious metals became money in virtually every corner of the world through natural choice. No king was smart enough to think of it first. It naturally arose in the exchange of the marketplace, one evolutionary trait at a time. The question in your mind might be then at this point, well, what about paper? We know that gold and silver was used as money within the lifetimes of our grandparents or maybe a generation or two before, but nobody uses it today as money, and almost everybody uses paper money. When did paper money come into existence? As near as we can tell, the first paper money was used in China many centuries ago, and also, as far as we can tell, it was a substitute for the real thing. I can imagine people using gold and silver in coin form, discovering that, hey, it gets a little heavy if you get a lot of this stuff, and then deciding to put it in a warehouse that today we might call a bank, and then later, whenever they want to buy something, instead of having to run down to the bank and retrieve the gold or the silver and then make the exchange, and then the other guy having to run it back to the bank and deposit it, instead, they began to simply write out on a piece of paper, pay to the bearer on demand a certain amount of gold or silver. And so it would be the paper certificate for the real thing that would actually be the method of exchange. And it would end up back at the bank, which would then, on its books, transfer the gold from one account to another. But the gold never left the bank. What people were actually using in exchange as money are receipts for the real thing. And paper money can retain its value as long as it's directly tied to the real thing. It's when that connection is broken that historically you have the phenomenon we call paper money hyperinflation. Before we get to that, I want to give you some examples of it because some are rather fascinating and even humorous. We have to say a further word about government and money. Not only today is paper money everywhere used, it's also true that everywhere people take for granted that the government should be in charge of it. But I'm one of those economists who says that that may be the case today, but the intellectual case for it is not a sound one. That government control over money leads to great mischief, with examples in a moment. But typically, when government decides to take over money, it's not done in one fell swoop. Let me give you the steps historically by which governments have taken a market invention and come to command money as if it were its own. Sometimes the first measure that governments take to get control over money is the declaration of a monopoly of the mint. A monopoly of the mint. Now just imagine a society where, let's say, precious metals, coins issued privately by banks, other traders in the marketplace, meeting standards that people are accustomed to accept, and as long as they're doing so without fraud and without deceit, there's hardly any reason to object to that. But let's imagine a society where money is coming forth from multiple sources. It's not hard to imagine the king or the emperor or the parliament at some point looking at this stuff and saying, wow, this is pretty powerful stuff. Whoever's in charge of this stuff called money can get whatever they want with it. And let's kind of make a move on it so we can get in charge of it ourselves. Sometimes the first step the government will take is to say, nobody but us, the government, gets to mint it. And they'll say, well, look, all these private mints is just leading to confusion and chaos, which it really doesn't, because the market, to the extent there is a demand for familiarity and standardization, it arises. We don't have laws that tell us that the screw threads for light bulbs all have to be made a certain way. That arises naturally in the marketplace. And you go buy a light bulb privately, you don't have to be concerned about whether or not it'll fit. You buy the one that does. And if there once was a multiplicity of screw threads, the ones that didn't suit a consumer satisfaction were dropped until we ended up with a manageable number, not by decree, but by evolutionary exchange. So governments come along and say, well, just the government will get to mint these gold and silver coins. And because, after all, this is pretty important stuff, and the government is in charge of so much, it ought to be in charge of a nation's money supply. We'll eliminate the confusion by having money come forth from one source. Now, on the surface, it may sound appealing to standardize the production of money that way. The problem is that when you grant anybody a legal monopoly over the production of anything, you open the door to debasement. You open the door to mischief of one kind or another. Governments didn't normally take over money with the idea of, hey, we have to make this more valuable and a better commodity as money. They take it over because they intend to use it for their own purposes. And that means to multiply it, because then they get to spend it first before it tends to bid up prices for everybody else in the marketplace. So monopoly of the mint is something that governments will declare, historically have declared, as a means to acquire control over money. A second thing they'll do is to pass or declare a legal tender law. Legal tender, and in fact on American paper notes today you see this term. Maybe it's on many other paper notes as well, issued by other governments. Legal tender simply means you must use the king's money. In other words, if you contract a debt with someone in dollars, well then, because paper dollars issued by the government are declared legal tender, that's the method by which the debt will ultimately be settled. You can't later say, you know, instead of using paper money, let's settle this debt in some other way. The debt will be canceled if you don't use the legal tender currency as declared by the government. Now, think of legal tender as a way that government is saying, no matter what we do with the money that we are producing, you've got to use it. That's not a guarantee of value or a guarantee of quality. What that basically says is, no matter what we might do with it, even if we dilute the precious metal content or otherwise play with your money and create mischief with it, doesn't matter, you got to use it anyway. In a marketplace where money is produced competitively and people are free to say, no, I don't want yours, I want to use that guy's, there's no need for a legal tender law. Any more than there is reason to declare this good or this service must be purchased by all consumers. The consumers will decide which are the good services and the reliable goods. So legal tender law really gives government a license to play havoc with the money it creates, and you and I as consumers end up paying the price for it. I want to move along a little bit because I see we're approaching the 45-minute point where we're to have questions. But there are other steps that government takes to consolidate its control over money. One is it will divorce the name of the money from a weight of metal. At one time, the word dollar derived from the term Thaler in modern-day Germany. It wasn't Germany then, but in any event, Thaler originated in German states, and it was a certain weight of precious metal. The British pound was once a pound of silver. But today, nobody thinks of their national currency in terms of a weight of metal. Governments have stripped that meaning from their name by stripping the backing, the redemption ability of the money into a precious metal. The next step it often takes is central banking. And the government says, oh, well, we realize that banking is pretty important to this stuff called money, and there are lots of private banks out there. Let's have our own bank. And then with central banking, the government's ability to manipulate the quantity and the quality of money is greatly enhanced. And it goes the full measure to total control over money when it adopts the final step, which is fiat, F-I-A-T, unbacked, irredeemable, inconvertible paper money. Fiat money is paper money issued by the government, backed by legal tender laws, a monopoly of the mint, and not convertible into the real thing. That's what we typically have now in just about every country in the world. Now, if you could wind the clock back several hundred years, and let's say if I could do that and go back to say 1700 or so, and with the knowledge we have now about money, and somebody said, we're going to give this government the ability to print paper money without end and without any connection to the real thing, I could predict what they would ultimately do to it, that they would print it until it wasn't worth anything. And that was just a matter of time. And in fact, that's what's happened in country after country. In the Western world, the first example of paper runaway inflation happened between 1715 and 1720 in France. King Louis XIV, the famous Sun King, the man who built the Palace of Versailles, fought a long series of wars with the rest of Europe. He died in 1715, and his son inherited a financial mess. His father had overspent, the French government was bankrupt, and in that situation with Louis XV, wondering what am I going to do with this mess, a man from Scotland got in to see him. His name was John Law. He had a scheme in mind, and he said to the king, and I'm paraphrasing, we don't know exactly how the discussion went, but we know the outcome of it. John Law probably said to the king, hey, you're in charge, you're the king, you got the army, just print paper and call it money and tell the peasants they have to use it, or else, no matter what you do with it, force them to use it. And maybe Louis XV said, wait a minute, we can't do that. Doesn't the paper have to be backed? We don't have the gold anymore. How can we print money if we haven't got a precious metal behind it? And it was John Law's idea that the king didn't need that. He said to Louis XV, just print it. If anything backs it, make it the army. Tell people, just shoot people if they don't use it, but make them use it. And it'll somehow retain its value. Well, Louis XV was not a very smart man, and he bought into the idea. He said, great, I'll put you in charge of the printing press. And in no time at all, they were printing a new French paper currency. And at first, everything looked great. People thought, wow, look at that, we're paying off our bills. We don't need to borrow anymore because we can just print the money, and the peasants will use it. But of course, as that money entered the system of exchange, it steadily lost its value. For the same reason, any substance will lose its value, all other things being equal, if you manufacture more of it. Any one unit will be worth less and less. So by 1720, only 5 years into this, the French currency became utterly worthless. And John Law, who was at first celebrated as the financial savior of France, becomes a hunted man. And the French chase him all over Europe, trying to make him pay for ruining the French economy. I'll close with an example from more recent times, and not so far away, as a matter of fact. I have here a stack of Bolivian pesos from 1985. A little bit of history here. In 1978, the Bolivian peso, the exchange rate with the US dollar, was 25 to the dollar. That meant that this stack of 1 million pesos in 1978 was worth about $40,000. $40,000 here, 1978. I went to Bolivia in 1985 to study their hyperinflation, which was running at that point at about 50,000% per year. The day I arrived in Bolivia, the peso was exchanging at about 150,000 to the dollar. And the day I left, it had risen to 200,000 to the dollar. So 1 million of these at 200,000 to the dollar means, tells you right there what I paid for it. $5 for this stack of 1 million pesos that was worth $40,000 just a few years before. That was in April of 1985. The Bolivian government continued to print until by August of that very year, those pesos became completely worthless. They had to call in the old ones, exchange them for a new paper currency with the promise they wouldn't do that again. But that's an example, not very far from home, in more recent times. Now, we haven't had a chance to talk about banking to any great detail. I focused on money, but depending on where your questions go, we can talk about that as well. So thanks everybody for the 45 or 46 minutes you've given your attention to this lecture, and I'm happy now to take some questions.